RAM, or random access memory, is temporary memory, and it's installed on the motherboard in the memory slots. A motherboard can have a various number of memory slots. The average motherboard will have between 2 and 4 of them. Memory slots come in different types, depending upon what type of RAM it accepts. For example, most motherboards have DIMM memory modules because it's the most common type to date. DIMM stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. A DIMM memory module has either 168, 184, or 240 pins. A DIMM is a dual inline module because it has 2 independent rows of these pins, one on each side. And DIMMs have a 64-bit data path. Another type of memory module is a SIMM. SIMM stands for Single Inline Memory Module. A SIMM is an older technology and has since been replaced by the much faster DIMM. A SIMM also has pins on both sides like a DIMM, but in a SIMM, the pins are redundant, compared to a DIMM, which are independent. A SIMM will either have 32 or 72 pins, and a 32-bit data path. Another type of memory module is called RAM, which stands for Rambus Inline Memory Module, which was developed by the company Rambus Inc. RIMs have 184 pins and look similar to a DIMM, with the exception that the bottom notches are located in the center of the module. In 1999, RIMs were a breakthrough in the speed of memory, but has quickly fallen behind due to the advancement of technology in DIMMs. Now the term 32 or 64-bit data path refers to the number of bits of data that are transferred in one cycle. The more bits that are transferred in one cycle, then the faster the computer will be. A single bit or 1 bit of data is the smallest form of data that a computer reads, because in the computing world, a computer only understands ones and zeros, which is represented by a single bit of data. Now there's also the term byte, and 8 bits is equal to 1 byte. So if a memory DIMM is rated to have a 64-bit data path, then that means that it has an 8-byte wide data path, or bus, because 64 divided by 8 equals 8. And if a memory SIMM that is rated to have a 32-bit data path, then that means that it has a 4-byte wide bus, because 32 divided by 8 equals 4. So that's why DIMMs are faster than SIMMs. Now this information will be useful in an upcoming lesson on how we determine the exact bandwidth of memory modules. In Section 1, we talked about secondary memory, which is permanent storage. This dealt with hard drives. Now we'll talk about primary memory, or temporary storage. This is called RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory. In order for data or a program to run, it needs to be loaded into RAM first. So here is how it works. The data or program is stored on the hard drive. Then from the hard drive, it is loaded into RAM. And once it's loaded into RAM, the CPU can now access the data or run the program. Now, a lot of times, if the memory is too low, it might not be able to hold all the data that the CPU needs. And when this happens, then some of the data has to be kept on the hard drive to compensate for low memory. So instead of data going from RAM to the CPU, it has to do extra work by going back to the hard drive. And when this happens, it slows down the computer. So to solve this problem, all you need to do is increase the amount of RAM on the computer. And by increasing the memory, all the data can be loaded into RAM without the need of constantly accessing the hard drive. And the result is a faster performing computer. RAM requires constant electrical power to store data, and if the power is turned off, then the data is erased. RAM is stored on the motherboard in modules called DIMMs. These DIMMs come in different memory sizes. Today, they range anywhere from 128 megs to 4 gigs of memory per DIMM or more. RAM also comes in different types, such as dynamic RAM or DRAM. DRAM is memory that contains capacitors, and because it has capacitors, it has to be refreshed often. SRAM stands for synchronous RAM. This memory uses transistors and does not have to be refreshed, unlike DRAM. And because of this, it is much faster than DRAM, and it is also very expensive. An example of SRAM would be the memory cache level 1 and 2 that is used by the CPU. Another type of memory is called SDRAM, which stands for synchronous DRAM. This type of memory is what is used today in RAM DIMMs. The difference between SDRAM and DRAM is basically speed. The older DRAM technology operates asynchronously with the system clock, which basically means that it runs slower than the system clock because its signals are not coordinated with it. But SDRAM runs in sync with the system clock, which is why it is faster than DRAM. All the signals are tied to the system clock for a better controlled timing. SDRAM is rated at different speeds. For example, a stick of SDRAM could be labeled PC100. The 100 equals the speed at which it operates, which is 100 megahertz. And since SDRAM only comes in 64-bit modules, it has an 8-byte wide bus, because 64 divided by 8 equals 8. So to figure out the total bandwidth of PC100, you multiply 100 megahertz times 8 bytes, which equals 800 megabytes per second. So the total bandwidth of PC100 equals 800 megabytes per second. So an SDRAM module labeled PC133, you multiply 133 by 8 bytes, which equals 1066. So the total bandwidth for PC133 equals 1066 megabytes per second. As technology increased and processor and bus speeds have gotten faster, a new RAM technology was developed to keep up with the faster speeds of computers. This newer technology was called DDR, which stands for double data rate. And that's basically what DDR does. It sends double the amount of data in each clock signal when compared to non-DDR RAM. Non-DDR or single data rate RAM uses only the rising edge of the signal to transfer data. But DDR uses both the rising and falling edges of the clock signal to send data, which makes DDR twice as fast. DDR is also labeled differently than non-DDR RAM. Instead of including the clock speed in its name, like PC133, where 133 equals the clock speed, DDR uses the total bandwidth instead. For example, a DDR DIMM labeled PC2700. The 2700 is not the clock speed, but it's the actual total bandwidth. The clock speed for PC2700 is 333 megahertz. So 333 megahertz times 8 bytes is rounded off to 2700 megabytes per second. which is where we get the name PC 2700. Another example is PC 3200. PC 3200 has a clock speed of 400 megahertz, so 400 times 8 equals 3200, which is where we get the name PC 3200. A new technology that has succeeded DDR is DDR2. DDR2 is faster than DDR because it allows for higher bus speeds, and it also uses less power than DDR. A DDR2 DIMM has 240 pins compared to 184 pins on DDR. Some examples of DDR2 are PC2 3200 and PC2 4200. And the latest RAM technology is called DDR3. DDR3 is twice as fast as DDR2, with a bandwidth of over 12,800 megabytes per second. Like DDR2, a DDR3 DIMM also has 240 pins, but the notches in the DIMMs are in different places. So you can't put a DDR3 DIMM in a RAM slot made for DDR2. In fact, motherboards are made to support a certain type of memory, so you can't mix DDR1, 2, or 3 on the same motherboard. Some examples of DDR3 are PC3 8500 and PC3 12800. Another type of memory was called RDRAM, which was developed by Rambus Inc. And they developed the RIM, which stands for Rambus Inline Memory Module. RIMs have 184 pins and look similar to DIMMs, with the exception that the bottom notches are located in the center of the module. In 1999, RIMs were a breakthrough in the speed of memory, but has quickly fallen behind due to the advancement of technology in DIMMs. When RDRAM debuted in 1999, it ran at 800 megahertz, which was considerably faster than SDRAM, which ran at 133 megahertz at that time. But even though it was a lot faster than SDRAM, RDRAM only had a 2-byte wide bus, compared to SDRAM, which had an 8-byte wide bus. So if you multiply the speed of RDRAM, which was 800 megahertz, times the bus width, which was 2 bytes, you will get a total bandwidth of 1600 megabytes per second. RIM technology was designed to work with a continuous signal, which means that all the other memory slots on the motherboard must be used for RIMs to work properly. And if other RIMs are not available, then a user can install a CRIM or continuity RIM, which is basically a dummy RIM to ensure continuity in all the memory slots. To meet the higher demands of faster processors and memory controllers, a new technology was developed called dual-channel mode. Dual-channel mode requires a pair of identical DIMMs installed on the motherboard, which allows the memory controller the ability to communicate with 2 DIMMs simultaneously, which increases the speed of accessing the memory. In order for dual channel to work, the motherboard must be equipped to work in dual channel mode, and the memory DIMMs must be identical to each other in speed, size, and features. Then the DIMMs must be inserted into the motherboard in a specific slot configuration in order to enable dual-channel mode. Typically, the memory slots will be color-coded to help assist in identifying where the DIMMs should be inserted. For example, here we have some dual-channel memory slots. So in order for dual-channel to work, you need to install a pair of identical DIMMs in the slots of the same color. In this case, we put a pair of DIMMs in the yellow slots. Some RAM modules have ECC, which stands for Error Correcting Code. And what this does is that it detects if the data was correctly processed by the memory module and makes a correction if it needs to. You can tell if a RAM module has ECC by counting the number of memory chips on the module. In a standard non-ECC DIMM, it will have 8 memory chips, but in an ECC module, it will have 9 memory chips. Most RAM modules today are non-ECC, and this is because of the advance in technology that has minimized memory errors and has made non-ECC RAM more stable. Typically today, ECC memory is mostly used in servers because servers need to be up and running at all times, and using ECC memory is just an extra precaution to guard against any memory errors.
A 4-bit register, so I have to use 4 flip-flops, and the flip-flop I'm going to use is D because I just want to store the data, no toggling and nothing else. So I just want the data to be stored, and for this D flip-flop is best. This is my first flip-flop. The input is D and the output is Q, and in the same way I will use 3 more D flip-flops, D, Q, and there will be a clock that will govern the operation, and this is my clock. Now there is one very important thing that you have to note. The clock is internally connected and applied at the same time. This clock is connected to all these 4 flip-flops internally and applied at the same time. In sequential circuit, clock pulse is not generated individually for every operation, but it is generated and given to all the operations. By this I mean I'm not going to generate the clock for this flip-flop, then this flip-flop, then this, and then this. I'm not going to generate 4 different clocks for this flip-flops, but I will have a same clock and it is given to the different operation. So we are bound to follow the clock. We are bound to follow the clock, and this is a problem in itself. I'm going to explain why it is a problem. For example, let's take a clock with a frequency 1 megahertz. I'm having a clock with a frequency 1 megahertz. This is the frequency, and you know that the time period is equal to 1 by f seconds. So time for frequency equals to 1 megahertz is equal to 1 microsecond. So the time period is 1 microsecond, and after 1 microsecond we will have the falling edge. It is negative edge triggered, so we will have the falling edge like this. These are the 2 falling edges, and the time is 1 microsecond. So after every 1 microsecond, whatever you store in this flip-flops will get changed. For example, if I want to store 1 0 1 1, then I have to simply give 1 as the input to this flip-flop and 0 as the input to this, 1 and 1 in the same way for the last 2 flip-flops. And when the next falling edge arrives, this value will get changed, that we don't want. For example, if I want to store my data for 100 microseconds, so what I have to do, because for every 1 microsecond the data is changing, our data is corrupted, we have the garbage value, what we want to store we are losing it, and if something is available forever, then we are not going to store it. What is the need to store if something is available forever? This 1011 is not going to be there forever. Once we have stored this value, it will change and we don't have the same combination of bits. And for the next clock pulse, whatever be the value here is going to be stored again. So we are losing our data. For this we have to use some independent control. And this independent control we call as load. Okay, and this load is of 2 types. The first one is the synchronous load, and the second one is obviously asynchronous load. For synchronous load, the flip-flop will be operational when the clock is high and also the load is high, but in case of asynchronous, only the load is high to change the value stored inside. So this is the independent control that is in our hand. When we make this load high, the data will change irrespective of the value of the clock. So what I will do, if I want to store a particular data 1011 for 100 microsecond, I'm going to make this load low for 100 microsecond. Like this is the clock, and let's say this time is 100 microsecond. So I will make my load low for this 100 microsecond. This is my load and it is low for the 100 microsecond, and there will be no change in the register. The value stored is not going to change. It will be 1011, and there will be clear input. You already know what is clear input. It will reset our flip-flops, and in this case it is going to reset all the values of the 4 flip-flops. This clear is connected inside to all these flip-flops. So this is a brief introduction about the registers, and in the next presentation we will see the data format and classification of registers. This is a very important thing that I have explained you right now, especially this load. This load is our independent control, and we don't want to lose our data for every passing clock pulse. That's why we use this load. So this is all. See you in the next presentation.
A computer's registers each store the same number of bits. When we want to manipulate what is stored in these registers, the register file will be instructed to send the contents of 2 registers to the ALU. In this example, the registers are 8 bits in length. The ALU will perform a calculation on these 2 values and send the result back to the register file to be stored. We tell the ALU what instruction to perform by sending it a set of control bits that encode a message of what operation to perform. Because the ALU is a combinational circuit, it will perform these calculations immediately. To simplify the diagram, we will use a bus notation where we group sets of wires together and indicate how many wires are in that group. Rather than draw 3 sets of 8 wires, we will simply draw 3 buses. An ALU can perform whatever arithmetic operations that we know how to implement, such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, as well as decrement and increment operations. Bitwise logical operators, such as not, and, or, and others, comprise a list of non-arithmetic operations, such as value comparisons, and setting a register's contents to 0. The details of these operations are covered in another lecture. Suppose that we have an ALU that receives 2 control bits. Because there are 2 control bits, we can encode 4 operations for the ALU to perform. I've chosen 2 arithmetic operations and 2 logic operations for this example. The ALU receives inputs from 2 8-bit registers and sends out 8 bits of information back to the register file. Based on the data from the control bits, the ALU knows which operation to perform. In this situation, the ALU calculates the sum and sends it to the register file. If we change the control bits, we will change which operation is performed. Because this operation does not need an input from B, the B inputs will be ignored. The ALU will send an incremented value of A back to the register file. To briefly introduce the logic operations, we will examine one of the simpler operations, such as the NOT operation. The NOT operation receives only one set of inputs, so again, the ALU will ignore the inputs from B. The NOT operation changes all zeros to ones and all ones to zeros. The NOT operation is applied to each bit in the register individually, otherwise called a bitwise operation. Finally, if we change the control bits again, the ALU will perform a clear operation, which means that we will set the contents of a register to 0. For this operation, the ALU ignores both inputs and simply sends out the value 0. Notice that the ALU is sending out 8 zeros, because all numbers, even 0, are encoded with the same number of bits in a computer. In this lecture,
the cover of the CPU and zoom in to see what happened to Arithmetic Logic Unit, or ALU for short. The ALU is what performs all the mathematical operation in input B, and assume they are 2 numbers from some previous load instructions. Now we might want to add those 2 numbers together. The control unit receives that instruction from RAM and then tells the ALU what type of operation to perform. The ALU performs the operation and then outputs the answer. Sometimes, though, depending upon the type of instruction, the output from the ALU can actually be ignored. For instance, if you have a compare instruction, the registers with their own set and enable wires. These may have numbers from previous instructions already saved inside. So the control unit will then turn on the set wire of the particular register that it wants to save that number to, and that number will be saved in that register. Afterward, the control unit will then turn off the enable wire from the first register and clear the bus. The 4 registers at the top are just used for storing numbers between operations, so they have output wires that go directly back onto the bus. So now we have moved a number from one register to another just by turning some wires on and off. That's the advantage of the bus, easily moving numbers between components. The disadvantage of the bus is that you can only have one number on it at a time. Because of this limitation, the arithmetic logic unit uses a temporary register for input B. When the control unit is processing an instruction involving the ALU, it will move one of the inputs to the temporary register. The temporary register has no need for an enable wire since it only outputs to the ALU and doesn't conflict with any other registers. The other input to the ALU comes directly from the bus. The control unit will enable another register, and that number will become input A to the instruction itself is in another register called the instruction register. By the way, the input wires from the bus won't affect this register since the instruction was already saved in a previous step. This register, like the temporary register, also has no need for an enable wire since it just outputs to the control unit. Based upon this instruction, the control unit then tells the ALU what type of operation. For that, we use the flags that we talked about earlier. Each flag is just a wire that turns on or off depending upon whether or not a certain condition is true. Inside the Scott CPU there are 4 flags, and we'll look at 2 of them now. The A is larger flag will turn on if input A is larger than input B. If the inputs are the same, then the equal flag turns on, and if both of these flags are off, that means input B is larger. But in this case, the equal flag is on, so that means both inputs are the same. Once the compare instruction is over, we still need to use the flags for the next instruction, so we'll save them to a register that only has 4 inputs and 4 outputs. This register. The CPU uses this register to know where the next instruction should come from in RAM. When the CPU is ready for the next instruction, it enables the instruction address register onto the bus. Eventually, the instruction address will flow to RAM, but it doesn't get there directly. There is an intermediary register called the memory address register, whose only job is to tell RAM what memory address the CPU wants next, since it won't always be an instruction. Once the instruction address is set into the memory address register, it is automatically sent to RAM since the memory address register doesn't have an enable wire. The control unit then turns on the enable RAM wire, and RAM automatically sends back the data at that address, which in this case is an instruction. That instruction is then saved in the instruction register, and the control unit begins processing it. In this case, it's a jump if equal instruction, which checks to see if the equal flag is on. It does that by running one of its wires and the equal flag wire into an AND gate. If both inputs to the AND gate are on, then the output wire turns on as well. This output wire will then trigger the jump. That jump eventually retrieves the next piece of data from RAM, which happens to be an address, and move it into the instruction address register. When the jump if equal instruction is over, the CPU then processes the instruction at that new address. At that new address may be some instructions that output the text "you guessed correctly" onto the screen, because now we know that the user guessed correctly. So we'll add the final 4 wires to our CPU, which are used to control the external devices like the monitor and the keyboard. We now have a nearly complete picture of what the Scott CPU looks like. Data moves around inside the CPU using the bus and is stored in each register according to how that data is going to be used. Each instruction that we have seen can be processed by the Scott CPU in about 6 clock ticks. Modern CPUs can process multiple instructions per clock tick, meaning that the computer you're using to watch this video is likely processing tens or even hundreds of billions of instructions per second. That phenomenal speed is accomplished by using more than one of each component and making sure that all the components are active as much as possible. This makes modern CPUs much more complicated than the Scott CPU, but they are still fundamentally doing the same things as the Scott CPU. So now let's zoom back out and we can see all the wires that run back out to the pins on the chip. On the right are the set RAM and enable RAM wires. On the top are the RAM address wires. On the bottom are the data wires that run to both RAM and the external devices. And on the left are the input-output control wires. So let's zoom back out.
Chào tất cả các bạn. Thì hôm nay chúng ta sẽ đi tiếp phần thứ hai trong cái loạt bài mình nói về đó là CPU. Thì ở bài trước thì mình đã trình bày cho các bạn về một yếu tố quan trọng mà khi chúng ta quan tâm về thông số kỹ thuật, đó chính là bus. Và bây giờ mình sẽ nói về cái thông số thứ hai, chính là bộ nhớ đệm. Đây chính là cách. Và các bạn lưu ý thì để hiểu được cái clip này thì những bạn nào chưa coi phần 1, như là cái phần mình nói về bớt á, thì các bạn coi qua đó nha. Rồi các bạn hãy coi tiếp phần này. Rồi, bây giờ thì mình xin được phép bắt đầu. Rồi, đầu tiên thì mình sẽ giới thiệu sơ qua về phần khái niệm bộ nhớ cách này. Thì các bạn lưu ý là một chiếc vi xử lý của chúng ta luôn tồn tại ít nhất hai bộ nhớ đệm là L1 cách và L2 cách. Ở những dòng CPU đời cao hiện giờ thì chúng ta sẽ có thêm một khái niệm về L3 cách nha. Rồi, cách của chúng ta là bộ nhớ đệm. Vậy thì cái bản chất của nó giống như là RAM. Thì đối với RAM thì chắc hẳn các bạn đã biết rồi. Khi mất điện thì những thông tin lưu trữ trên RAM sẽ mất hết. Và cách nó cũng sẽ tương tự như vậy. Cái này có thể dễ thấy là ở máy bàn. Khi mà các bạn chưa cắm điện nha. Mình ví dụ khi các bạn chưa cắm điện, rồi các bạn bắt đầu mới cắm điện vào, các bạn bấm khởi động máy, thì nó sẽ lâu hơn so với khi là ví dụ các bạn khởi động máy lên rồi, các bạn shut down hoặc các bạn restart, thì cái lần khởi động tiếp theo á, máy của chúng ta sẽ khởi động nhanh hơn. Vì lúc này cách của chúng ta đã có điện nuôi, cho nên lần khởi động tiếp theo nó sẽ nhanh hơn so với lần đầu cách của chúng ta chưa có điện. Đó. Rồi, thì cách nó giống như RAM thì bản chất của nó cũng giống y hệt RAM luôn. Đó là về cái công nghệ sản xuất cách á. Thì đầu tiên thì trước khi nói về công nghệ sản xuất cách thì mình nói sơ qua cái công nghệ sản xuất RAM đã. Bởi vì công nghệ sản xuất cách này cũng giống như công nghệ sản xuất RAM. Ở công nghệ sản xuất RAM thì trên thị trường chúng ta hiện giờ chúng ta có thể thấy là SDRAM và DDRAM. Đó, công nghệ sản xuất SDRAM là Static Random Access Memory, đó chính là bộ nhớ tĩnh. Còn DDRAM đó là Dynamic Random Access Memory, tức là bộ nhớ động. Thì hai cái công nghệ sản xuất RAM này nó khác nhau như thế nào? Thì đầu tiên cái khác nhau thứ nhất đó chính là nguyên vật liệu lưu trữ thông tin. Đó, sản xuất cách á, như lúc nãy mình có nói á, ở cách thì họ sẽ dùng công nghệ là SDRAM để sản xuất nha. Đó, ở RAM thì họ dùng công nghệ DRAM, nhưng với cách của CPU họ lại dùng SDRAM. Thì tại sao lại như vậy? Thì lúc nãy mình có nói sơ qua cái ưu điểm giữa transistor với tụ điện, chắc các bạn cũng đã biết rồi nha. Đó, bởi vì sao? Vì do RAM không đòi hỏi cơ chế là xử lý dữ liệu tức thời. Chúng ta nhìn lại cái mô hình này. Đây, cái mô hình này thì ở clip trước mình đã cho các bạn xem. Thì đây mình xin được chiếu lại. Đó chính là khi mà dữ liệu của chúng ta truyền từ RAM lên Memory Controller Hub, sau đó mới truyền lên CPU. Ở dòng CPU đời mới thì cái Memory Controller Hub này nè, nó nằm trong CPU luôn. Khi mà cái khoảng thời gian á, khi chúng ta RAM đưa dữ liệu lên đây được phải không? Rồi, từ đây nó sẽ đưa tiếp lên CPU. Thì khoảng thời gian mà từ Memory Controller Hub đưa lên CPU á, thì nó sẽ yêu cầu RAM sẽ nạp tiếp lên. Đó, cho nên chúng ta có thể giải quyết được cái độ trễ nhờ cái Memory Controller Hub này. Đó, chính là như vậy. Đó, khoảng thời gian mà từ đây lên đây thì sẽ yêu cầu RAM tiếp tục nạp lên, cho nên chúng ta sẽ giải quyết được cái độ trễ. Rồi, vậy mà khi dữ liệu của chúng ta đã đưa được lên CPU này rồi, thì lúc này tốc độ CPU nó sẽ xử lý nha. Mà như các bạn thấy rồi, tốc độ xử lý của CPU rất là nhanh, cho nên chúng ta không được phép có độ trễ. Đó, và chính vì không được phép có độ trễ đó, người ta phải sử dụng cái công nghệ đó là công nghệ SDRAM, 100% là transistor, vì không phát sinh độ trễ. Đó, đó chính là lý do vì sao mà RAM họ đã dùng tụ điện và bộ nhớ cách CPU họ đã dùng transistor. Vì transistor này không có độ trễ, cho nên họ bắt buộc phải dùng trong CPU. Bởi vì khi dữ liệu một khi đã nằm trên CPU rồi thì bắt buộc phải xử lý rất là nhanh với tốc độ rất lớn và không được phát sinh độ trễ. Đó. Rồi. Và các bạn cũng lưu ý là với bất kỳ một thiết bị nào á, nếu mà họ trang bị bộ nhớ cách thì họ sẽ dùng công nghệ sản xuất đó là transistor nha. Với Rồi, thì tương tự lớp với L1 cách thì người ta cũng sẽ phủ lên ở phía trên L1 cách này nè, một cái lớp bảo vệ thứ hai, cũng đến hàng triệu transistor luôn, và chúng ta sẽ có thêm là L2 cách. Đây. Ở đây mình vẽ để phân biệt L1 L2 nên mình ở màu nhìn nó hơi khó chút xíu, chứ thật ra cái lớp L2 của chúng ta nè là nguyên cả cái vùng mình đang rê chuột nè, vì phủ phía trên mà các bạn. Nên L2 sẽ nằm trên L1 phủ hết cái này trên này luôn. Đó, tương tự L3 sẽ phủ hết. Rồi. Thì như lúc nãy mình nói là một cách của chúng ta rất quan trọng, nhưng mà các bạn thấy là dung lượng của nó rất là thấp. Vì trong L1, L2, L3 cách thì L1 cách có dung lượng thấp nhất, nhưng mà nó là quan trọng nhất. Bởi vì tiết diện của L1 chúng ta thấy nó rất là bé. Đây, L1 cách chỉ có khoảng chừng này thôi. Đó, L2 cách của chúng ta là nguyên ở vùng này luôn. Đó, cho nên L1 cách của chúng ta thường không thiên về lưu chứa dữ liệu cho lắm, mà nó chỉ thiên về chứa các thuật toán xử lý thôi. Đó, rồi. L2 là ba cách của chúng ta như các bạn thấy tiết diện nó rất là lớn. Đây là hai cách ta nguyên vùng này nằm phía trên mà. Đó là ba cách nằm phía trên là hai cách nguyên vùng này, cho nên dung lượng là 3 cách sẽ lớn hơn là 2 cách, và là 2 cách có dung lượng sẽ lớn hơn là 1 cách. Rồi. Vậy thì cái chức năng thật sự của L2 là 3 cách là gì? Như nãy giờ mình nói thì nó là chứa dữ liệu, nhưng mà chứa dữ liệu này là theo cái kiểu gì? Thì chức năng L2 là 3 cách này nè. Nó chứa dữ liệu và sẽ giúp CPU của chúng ta giảm được cái độ trễ nha. Đó chính là như thế này. Đây. Ở hình vẽ này đây. Mình ví dụ đây là cái core nha. Đó, bên ngoài lớp này là màu cam này nè. Đó chính là L1 cách, mình vẽ tượng trưng xíu. Rồi, bên ngoài là L2 cách. Đó. Rồi. Thì trong cái quá trình mà xử lý dữ liệu á, các bạn có thể thấy là RAM với CPU tốc độ rất chênh lệch nhau. Đó, tốc độ CPU rất nhanh. Tốc độ của RAM thì chắc chắn không bằng CPU rồi. Đó, vậy nên chúng ta sẽ phát sinh một vấn đề như thế này. Đó chính là mình ví dụ RAM của chúng ta đưa lên CPU 6400 MB dữ liệu trong 1 giây, CPU xử lý xong. Đó, nhưng mà RAM này không thể nào mà vận chuyển tiếp cho chúng ta thêm 6400 MB dữ liệu tiếp theo mà trong vòng 1 giây được. Bởi vì tốc độ của RAM đâu bằng CPU. Cho nên khi CPU 1 giây xử lý xong nè, RAM này nè phải tốn hơn 1 giây để vận chuyển tiếp thêm dữ liệu lên trên này. Đó, chính vì vậy CPU nó phải chờ, và cái khoảng chờ đó chúng ta phải phát sinh thêm một cái độ trễ. Đó, như lúc nãy mình có nói chúng ta có MCH, Memory Controller Hub á, đó, MCH á, để chúng ta giải quyết được độ trễ. Nhưng mà một mình MCH chưa đủ nha. Một mình Memory Controller Hub chưa đủ, cho nên chúng ta phải có thêm L2 là 3 cách nữa. Vậy thì L2 là 3 cách này, ở đây mình vẽ L2 nha. Nếu chúng ta thích thì có vẽ thêm L3 cũng được. Rồi, ở L2 cách này thì nó sẽ L2 là 3 cách á, nó sẽ sử dụng một công nghệ, đó là công nghệ Smart Card. Cái công nghệ này nó là như thế nào? Đây, nó chính như thế này nè. Khi mà RAM vận chuyển 6000 MB lên CPU đang xử lý nha, thì trong 1 giây lúc đó, mà trong lúc CPU đang xử lý á, thì L2 là 3 cách này nó cũng sẽ yêu cầu RAM nạp lên tiếp bằng cách nó đoán mò. Như là ví dụ CPU đang xử lý công việc A nha, thì trong lúc CPU đang xử lý A thì L2 là 3 cách này nó sẽ kêu RAM là chuyển tiếp những cái dữ liệu nào mà liên quan đến A. Vì là nó sẽ đoán mò thôi, nó sẽ chuyển mò lên những dữ liệu nào liên quan đến A và nó nạp sẵn trên L2 hoặc là 3 cách này. Đó, nạp sẵn trên L2 và L3 cách. Và sau khi CPU xử lý xong á, từ L2 L3 cách nó sẽ đưa vào cho con này xử lý luôn, rất là nhanh nha. Nghĩa là nó sẽ lưu trữ sẵn trên L2 L3 cách này, và khi xử lý xong thì sẽ chuyển từ L2 L3 cách này vô trong đây xử lý. Và tiếp tục L2 L3 cách sẽ dùng Smart Card tiếp, nó tiếp tục đoán mò tiếp. Đó, ví dụ chuyển A vô đây rồi, tiếp tục phải chuyển dữ liệu B lên, thì L2 L3 cách sẽ yêu cầu RAM này gửi dữ liệu nào liên quan đến dữ liệu B lên, nạp sẵn trên L2 L3 cách và đưa vô xử lý. Đó. Đó chính là lý do vì sao chúng ta phải có thêm lớp L2 L3 cách đó. Bởi vì lớp L1 cách của chúng ta nó cũng chứa dữ liệu được, nhưng mà chúng ta thấy lớp L1 của chúng ta chứa nhiều thuật toán xử lý, cho nên L1 của chúng ta thiên về xử lý hơn là chứa dữ liệu. Cho nên phải có L2 L3 cách với dung lượng lớn hơn để chứa những dữ liệu, xử lý những công việc mà lúc mà yêu cầu RAM tiếp tục nạp lên. Đó chính là lý do vì sao chúng ta phải có thêm L2 L3 cách. Đó chính là như vậy. Rồi, vậy thì như chúng ta thấy, tốc độ chúng ta sẽ ưu tiên cuối cùng. Cái quan trọng thứ nhì chúng ta ưu tiên đó chính là cái cách. Đó, vì sao quan trọng thì nguyên cả clip này mình vừa giới thiệu xong. Và cái quan trọng đầu tiên mà chúng ta lưu ý đó chính là bus. Mình đã giải thích ở clip trước. Đó, đó chính là một thông số bus. Rồi, ở clip cuối cùng thì mình sẽ nói về tốc độ xử lý và mình sẽ xong cái phần CPU này. Thì sau khi xong phần CPU này mình dự tính sẽ làm tiếp clip về RAM. Thì tới đây mình xin hết. Thì cũng lâu rồi mình chưa up clip mới. Cũng từ khi mà mình up clip bus này lên thì chắc cũng gần 2 tháng rồi mình mới up clip này lên. Tại do mình bận quá, cũng không có thời gian chuẩn bị nội dung kỹ lắm. Rồi, cái gì thì mong các bạn thông cảm. Rồi, cảm ơn các bạn đã theo dõi clip của mình.
It all started back in 1981 when IBM created the original IBM PC. That machine used a Intel 8088 CPU running at 4.77 megahertz, which resulted in the blazingly fast I/O bandwidth of 4 megabytes per second. The ISO standard, however, was created a few years later in 1984 when the PC-80, the improved PC, was created, which used the 8286 CPU. And that CPU uses a 16-bit data bus running at 8 megahertz for a total memory and I/O card bandwidth of 60 megabytes per second. There are two versions of the ISA card. The original 8-bit, which was used for the 8088 or original IBM PC. And you also have the 16-bit extended cards from the PC-80, which is technically only the ISA bus. The original one is not technically part of the ISA standard. Only the 16-bit one is actually spelled out in the standard, but commonly we call both of those card versions the ISA card. So depending on the actual CPU used, the 8088 or the 286, you can address either 1 meg or 16 meg of address range on the CPU bus and therefore also on the I/O cards. Both of these CPUs support 64K of address space. One of the problems, of course, is that the ISA bus is not very fast. It was an old design from 1980, essentially. And after about 10 years, when Windows came along and other GUI-based operating systems, the I/O bandwidth was not enough to support the advanced graphics cards that started to come along. So the graphic cards manufacturers came together and through their group, the VESA group, Video Electronic Standards Association, created a VL bus or VESA local bus, which essentially was again a direct attachment of the graphics card and any other card, I/O card that you wanted to directly connect with high performance, and they connected it to the CPU memory bus again. And because the top of the line CPU at the time was the 486 CPU running at 33 megahertz, that was the bus standard for the VL local bus. And the problem, of course, with doing that is that they married it to the 486 CPU bus protocol, and when other CPUs came out, particularly the Pentium, it used a different bus protocol, and the VL bus was no longer an option. It simply didn't work. Later on, IBM tried to create a future-proof and CPU-independent alternative to the ISA bus as part of their MCA microchannel architecture design. And we'll talk about that bus and the VL bus in some future slides. This slide shows the original IBM PC-80 motherboard from 1984. This is the board that uses a 8286 CPU. And you can here see the two different slots. This is the legacy original PC slot, and this is the extended, you can see the extension here, connector for the actual ISA slot, which is part of the ISA standard from 1984. So technically this is the only true ISA slot, but we refer to both as ISA slots and therefore ISA boards. So in this slide behind me here, you see the pinout of the ISA bus connector. This is the whole connector for the that is spec'd as part of the 286 computer, and this part here is the original PC connector, the 8-bit. You have 8 data bits on this connector, and you have another 8 on this. So in total, you have 16 for the whole interface.
The abbreviation SCSI is pronounced SCSI, and this stands for Small Computer Systems Interface. It was a method of connecting storage devices at that time were small computer systems or personal computers, and it was one of the very first ways that we had standardized storage on our computer systems. We were able to do quite a bit with this. We could string a number of devices together. They could be hard drives, they could be optical storage devices, and we could put up to 16 devices on one of these SCSI chains using a single cable and a single SCSI controller. So you were able to just put one interface in your computer and simply hang off the back of that interface 16 different devices. Through the years, there have been a number of different kinds of SCSI formats. You may see it called fast SCSI, ultra SCSI, there's ultra wide SCSI, there's ultra 2 SCSI, and so on. All of these formats tend to be backwards compatible, but the best possible performance you're going to be would be to get a storage device and a controller that were using the same type of SCSI interface. Before USB came along, SCSI was really the standard for connecting our peripherals together. We would plug in printers, scanners, tape drives, CD-ROM drives, anything that needed an external connection. SCSI was the format that we were using. On these SCSI buses, we had different sizes. We had a narrow bus SCSI. Some SCSI was a wide bus. The narrow bus could plug in 8 devices that we could string onto an individual controller. The wide bus allowed us to have 16 different devices on a single controller. The part of SCSI that really makes it powerful is that the interface and the communication itself is very, very intelligent. It's very powerful. We were able to do a lot of different communication over that SCSI bus, and it was very simple to plug in. Even though we were able to control so many diverse kinds of devices, it was a single type of interface. We assign a number to it, and now we've got a SCSI connection on our computer. SCSI has been around for a very, very long time. But even today, especially in large server farms, we see SCSI interfaces for hard drive controllers, and especially on virtualized environments, we see a lot of SCSI being used. Even though it's not a physical SCSI connection, we're still using that SCSI standard of protocols to communicate over these virtualized systems. One particular piece of SCSI that was very important, especially early on in SCSI, was the termination. You could plug many devices in, but the last device had to have what we called a terminator on the end of the chain. That way, the SCSI communication knew exactly where the signal ended. Without a terminator, none of these devices would be able to operate properly. The newer SCSI devices tend to have these terminators built into the device, and you can enable or disable the terminator just by clicking a button. But the older devices needed a physical terminator that you would connect to the interface that was on back of the SCSI device. There are many different types of interfaces that you'll see for SCSI. They've changed quite a bit through the years. Here's an example of one. You can see this one happens to be an Ultra 3 SCSI connection, and you can see a PATA connection right next to it. They're almost the same size. The SCSI might be a little bit shorter. This is a view from above. If we were to look at it from the side, you can see the interface connector is a little bit different than the PATA or the SATA connections that we've used before. This SCSI connection has quite a number of pins associated with it. The cable that we would use to connect this would be something like this, where we would plug into the motherboard, and then there might be many different connections on that same cable where we could use all of these different SCSI devices and plug them all in at the same time. If we were to look closer, you can really see a lot of different pins being used. And on this particular SCSI connection, it was a higher bandwidth, so it needed a lot more pins to be able to communicate. But it may not be this type of connection that you would see with SCSI. Because they've changed so much through the years, you might see a DB25 connection that looks like a serial, or maybe even an older parallel connection. They all look very similar, but these are actually SCSI connections. You have to look very carefully to see the differences. Some connections are very clear that they're SCSI. This high density 50 pin connection has locks on the side of it that connect in. That's very, very exclusive to SCSI. And some of these higher density connections as well really make you see that very quickly that's a SCSI connection. There's nothing else that looks quite like those connectors. When you're physically connecting SCSI devices to the SCSI cable that you have, whether they are inside of a computer or outside of a computer, you have to give each one of them a completely unique number. This is called a SCSI ID. So on that single bus, on that single connection coming out of an interface of a computer, we would provide different IDs. For instance, if this was your boot disk, maybe we'll give that SCSI ID 0. If there's a floppy disk or a scanner or an optical device, we might assign that a number 2. If there's a CD-ROM, we might assign that with a SCSI ID of 3. There's also a concept within SCSI connections called a logical unit. So within each physical SCSI ID on that interface, you might have logical units inside of this. This was very common to see if you were plugging in an external SCSI storage device that had multiple hard drives inside of it. You would give the storage device itself a SCSI ID, and then there would be logical units assigned to the individual drives within that single physical device. You also see this quite a bit when you're working with virtualized systems. As I mentioned earlier, the signal that is at the very end of the SCSI bus has to be terminated. There might be a physical terminator, or it might be a termination functionality that's built into the hardware itself. If you ever see what we call SCSI attached devices that are serial attached SCSI, they don't have jumpers, they don't have terminators, they don't have settings. A lot of the more modern storage devices that we are plugging in over something called serial attached SCSI are completely automated in the way that they configure themselves on that SCSI bus. Here's an example of a legacy SCSI device. I think this is an optical device, but it could be a hard drive, it could be a scanner, it could be anything else. Generally, we see two different types of connectors on the back of the device. One of them generally is the connection going in. You can see it written on the back of the device, where we would plug in the in connection from our computer. If we had additional SCSI devices, we would use this out connection to keep the string going, to keep that daisy chain going throughout the connection. If this was the end of the line, if this really was the last device in this SCSI chain, this is where we would plug in the terminator. If this was a device that had the termination built in, there would probably be a connector on this device, or a button you could push to say this was the terminating place. And you can also see the SCSI ID number built right into this as well. There's little buttons that would allow you to change that SCSI ID. So when this device plugged in and communicated across the SCSI bus, everyone know that this device was SCSI ID number 6. Once you have everything plugged in, it looks a little like this, where you have a SCSI controller that might be ID 0. Here's SCSI ID 1. That's a hard disk. Here's another hard disk, and they're all chained together with different SCSI IDs. And at the end of the chain is a terminator. Usually these terminators even have a little light so you can see that they are active. Here's a picture of what a SCSI terminator might look like, so you can look at the back of your devices and see if you have one of those. That term daisy chain actually came from this idea of taking daisies and connecting them to each other, and you could wear them as bracelets or wear them on your head. And that same daisy chaining was how we came up with this idea of plugging in all of these devices one to the other to create that chain of devices. The back of the SCSI drive looks very similar to the back of any other hard drive. It's just using a very specialized SCSI connection on the back. Usually you have jumpers that can help you designate what the SCSI ID of this drive happens to be. And here's traditional power that you might find so that that drive can be powered up on the inside of your computer. If this was an external device, then you have external power. You usually have options for setting your SCSI IDs that we saw on the SCSI device earlier, and the interfaces for going in and out of that SCSI connection. The connection of the SCSI device on your motherboard looks very similar to PATA in that we've got a connection on the motherboard and multiple interfaces on SCSI. But of course, with PATA, we are limited to 2 individual devices, whereas with SCSI, especially the wide bus SCSI, I can connect up to 16 devices, and you would simply find the closest connector to you and plug it in. It doesn't matter where along this particular cable we plug in our SCSI device. The determination of how this device communicates is associated with the ID that you assign to the SCSI device. So you simply plug into the closest connector to you and plug in all of your different SCSI devices, make sure they have different SCSI IDs, and your SCSI communication is now complete. Once you follow those rules, SCSI is very simple to get running, and it's going to provide you with a lot of flexibility to plug in multiple storage devices.
So finally we have arrived to the PCI bus, which stands for Peripheral Component Interconnects. It was originally created by Intel for chip-to-chip communication, and therefore the Peripheral Component Interconnect name, but it was also used as an I/O bus interface, and that's how we most know it today. So like this slide shows, it was created by Intel and later part of the PCI SIG, Special Interest Group, to bring together best ideas from prior bus architectures. The bus runs at 133 megabytes per second. 64 bits data width was supported, although not commonly implemented because of cost on the target platform. One major feature was full plug and play. And the way this works is that cards report the memory and other resources needs to the operating system. The operating system then asks the device drivers to configure the cards and to use those resources it has assigned. However, later on, due to larger and larger PCI bandwidth used, especially by high-end graphics card, a separate bus in the form of AGP, Advanced Graphics Port, was actually later created. Here on this next slide, you'll see a motherboard with 4 PCI Express slots, and you can compare those with the 4 older ISA slots right here. And this one is a Pentium motherboard. Here is a slide that describes the overall architecture of the PCI bus in the system. And the key thing to note here is that you have a bridge chip between the processor and the local bus, the PCI local bus. It's actually a little bit of a misnomer here in this picture to call it a local bus because it's not actually local. Local buses should be attached to the processor, but it's a PCI bus. The way the bridge works is that the operating system configures the bridge to map a portion of the processor's address space to PCI address space. These two address spaces are completely separate. If the processor then, by using a device driver for the device that is being accessed, accesses a register that the bridge recognizes as being mapped to a graphics card or another card here, then the bridge would claim that primary bus transaction, the memory bus transaction, and create a secondary transaction on the PCI local bus. That secondary transaction would then be claimed by the graphics card here, for instance. The graphics card would do the read or write or whatever transaction is being performed. Could be I/O too. And then the transaction would complete on the secondary bus, on the PCI bus. The bridge would then complete the primary bus. So it works as a bus master, if you will, on the PCI bus on behalf of the processor. This slide shows the PCI bus interface signals. There are 2 groups of signals. One is the required pins group and one is the optional pins group. So let's start with what's optional. What is optional is to implement the 64-bit parts of the signal, so that if your device is a 32-bit device, only lives in the lower 32 bits of the address space, for instance, then it does not need to implement these signals. Also, you don't need to have interrupt support if your device is, for example, a polling device that does not interrupt. You don't need those. And also, you don't need the JTAG signals. What you do need is the address and data signals to get the address assigned to the device and the data in or out. You need command byte enable The byte-enabled signals are used for reading or writing individual bytes. So you might want to write the first 2 bytes, but not all 4 bytes in a 32-bit D word. You have a parity signal, so that parity can be checked. If there's something wrong with the parity, you would report that to the operating system or the other side, rather, depending on who's reading and writing, using the parity error signal. If there's something else wrong, critically wrong, you can assert the system error signal, in which case the system would basically bug check and lock up, if not handled in any other way. You have request grant for bus mastering. You have clock and reset signals. And this is pretty much everything needed to implement a PCI compliant device. This slide shows the configuration space registers. On PCI, you actually have 3 unique address spaces that can be used. The first 2 are the normal memory and I/O address spaces, which are used for accessing registers within the device that are related to your the operation of a device. The third address range on PCI is the configuration space. The configuration space registers are used by the operating system to learn about the capabilities of the device and what resources the device needs to do its work. So I'm going to go through the various registers behind me and give you an overview what they are used for. The most important registers are the vendor ID register, the device ID, and the base address registers, or also called bars. The vendor and device ID registers are used for plug-and-play purposes. The operating system goes and reads these 2 registers on all devices to learn the manufacturer and what type of device it is, and based on that information it would match that with a device driver that will configure the card. The base address registers are used for letting the operating system know what memory and I/O ranges are needed by the card to do its work. So how this works is that the operating system reads the type and size required for each register bank. You might, for instance, have 4 kilobytes of I/O space, and you might have another 8 kilobytes of memory mapped space that the card needs to do its work. So the operating system goes and reads the size of it and determines a location within the overall memory space of the system, and then writes that the base of that address, and that's why it's called base address registers, the base of the start of that range within the system memory, writes it in those registers, and therefore later the operating system and device drivers will be able to learn what register addresses to write and read to access functionality within the device. The revision ID register is simply used to tell the device driver whether there are any revisions to the hardware that the driver needs to be aware of. The class code is used for standard type devices such as ID controllers or maybe VGA graphics cards, and that allows the operating system to assign operating system provided drivers, for instance standard VGA driver for a graphics card. If you do that, you don't need the exact driver supplied by the vendor. You can use a standard class driver for that particular device instead. Cache LAN size, latency timer, and built-in self-tests I'm not going to talk much about. the header type is a field that describes whether this particular device is an end point device, whether it's a bridge or whether it's some other type of device. Normally that would be header type 0, which is just a regular endpoint device, but type 1 is for bridges and so on. Type 2 is actually for card bus devices. Subsystem, vendor and device ID. I'm not going to talk much about that. Expansion ROM base address, that's if you have a device like an Ethernet controller that you could boot from, or a disk controller with supplied ROM, then this will actually point to the location of that code further in memory beyond this header space here. Capabilities is something that does the same thing. It points to other structures in memory that spells out particular capabilities of the device. And that's essentially a linked list in memory that you can walk. Interrupt line and interrupt pin is used, those registers are used for assigning interrupts to this particular device in case the device needs it. Minimum and maximum latency and min grant, max latency, that's used for bus arbitration. Essentially higher priority devices gets access to the bus sooner and so forth. I hope that gave you a little bit of overview how this works. There will be a separate presentation in the future on PCI bus and the use of the configuration space registers in more detail. After about 6 years of use of the PCI bus, the extended PCI or PCI-X specification was released. And I will spell out some features of the PCI-X bus in this slide. The main performance improvement made in the PCI-X bus was that the clock frequency was increased from 66 to 533 megahertz. That eventually made the maximum bandwidth jump from about 133 megahertz as in the original PCI spec up to 4.2 gigabytes per second. Unfortunately, when you go to the high clock frequencies, the number of devices that can load the bus goes down from about 6 devices as in the original PCI to just 1 device. Essentially, it's no longer a bus but a point-to-point protocol then. IBM, Compaq and HP as part of PCI SIG, they were driving the development of the PCI-X spec. Intel wanted a better option, and actually they were working on PCI Express, not to be confused with PCI-X. PCI Express will be explained in future slides. There are some protocol improvements over PCI in PCI-X. Here are the main features. There's a split response transaction that did away with polling on the bus, so that increased the efficiency of the bus. You have MSI, signal interrupt, MSI, message signal interrupts. So you can signal interrupts by write directly to the PCI bridge rather than use dedicated int-x interrupt lines. Due to higher cost, just like in PCI, only server pieces normally use 64-bit PCI-X. Desktop systems for regular consumer use normally stayed with 32-bit and also 32 megahertz PCI cards. And later the desktop systems also went directly from PCI to PCI Express, so they never implemented the PCI-X. PCI Express is actually very low cost solution, although also very high performance, as we'll see later. Some of the problems with going wide, as in PCIX, 64-bit wide buses with very high frequency, is that with high frequency it's very hard to keep the length of the traces in the buses the same, and if they don't if they're not correctly length matched, then you have a problem with the setup and hold timing of the signals, and I will explain what that means in a later slide. And also one of the issues here with wide buses in general is that it ties up a lot of I/O pins on the chipset, which limits the overall chip functionality, and that's one of the main features in PCI Express that we'll talk about later, is that it only uses 2 signals per direction for a very high frequency serial bus instead. In this slide it is shown that there are different keying on PCI cards depending on the voltage that the card can work with. So if you have a card that only works with 3.3 volts, you have only this key right here, and the same goes for 5-volt cards. You have this key in here. There are some cards that are universal, which means that they have dual voltage drivers and receivers, so they can work at any voltage, and you have the keying in both locations. Essentially, you don't have to worry too much about the keying. If the card fits in a slot, it will work. And this slide talks a little bit more about the setup and hold timing skew between signals. Essentially, this is an electrical engineering issue with digital design, which says that if you have a digital signal that you clock in a flip-flop, you have to have the signal stable within outside of the invalid voltage zone, so it either has to be a clear high or a clear low a certain time, which is the setup time from here to here, before the clock signal comes around to latch the signal. And the same goes after the clock signal. The data signal has to be stable during this hold time. If you have too little setup time, too little hold time, then you will end up with a situation called metastability, and that essentially means that you don't get the logic level that you expect, and it might be random. It might actually change after some nanoseconds. Chaos will surely ensue. And finally, we have reached the year 2004, where PCI Express was introduced on the PC platform. Behind me, this slide shows some of the major features of PCI Express. Since I will cover PCI Express in depth in a separate presentation, I will just briefly give you an overview here. For the details, please see that separate PCI Express 101 presentation. So the first thing to note about PCI Express, it is actually not a bus, but a point-to-point link. The reason for that is that in order to communicate with high-speed serial data on a gigabit per second rate, you actually cannot use a multi-drop bus like in PCI Express. The signal integrity and ringing and reflections would completely ruin the signal integrity for the high-speed serial link. Another feature with PCI Express is that the clock is encoded within the serial data stream. And the advantage with that is that the receiver can synchronize its local receiver clock to the same clock that was used to send the data out with. And note that you can do that without carrying a separate clock signal like for other common clock or source synchronous clock buses. And the way this is done is through a clever encoding of the data using an 8B10B encoding algorithm, which was actually created by IBM back in 1984 and used in fiber channel and other serial link protocols. So the 8B10B encoding was simply reused within PCI Express. It was proven and it worked well. PCI Express is software backwards compatible of the configuration space registers, which of course, as previously explained, is used by plug and play. And that means that the operating system and drivers cannot see, just by looking at the registers, that the card is a PCI Express card. It looks the same as a PCI card. Theoretically, that would mean that a operating system could boot very easily with devices that are ported to PCI Express from PCI. PCI Express is also software backwards compatible with regards to I/O and memory mapped device registers, and that means that the drivers that were created for PCI-based devices could easily be reused for PCI Express versions of those devices. And also the length matching between lanes, which I talked about with regards to setup and hold time, is very relaxed. There is separate lane-to-lane DSKU built into the receivers in hardware. This slide behind me shows how PCI Express slots look in comparison with the older PCI slots. You can see that the slots are very similar. The difference is that the PCI Express slots have a different size depending on the number of data lanes it uses. So this one has a by one lane, only one link, or I should say one differential pair going in and one going out to and from the device. And here you have 16 pairs going in and out from and to the device. The 6x16 slot is usually used for graphics cards that want maximum bandwidth, and the by one slot is used for most other general purposes devices. And a by one slot you can transfer for Gen 1 PCI Express about 250 megabytes per second, which is plenty enough for most devices. This slide shows essentially the growth of bandwidth going all the way back to the beginning of PCI through all the versions, PCI 2, PCI X, PCI 3, and so on. After PCI 3, there was a shift to PCI Express, of course, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and every single time the version number was bumped up, essentially the throughput doubled. 2.5, 5, 2010 almost doubled. PCI Express again, not quite, because of different signaling protocols. And here we see some throughput numbers for the different versions of the PCI Express bus. So you can see here again that PCI Express Gen 1 had about 250 megabytes per second throughput. Gen 2 it doubled, Gen 3 almost doubled, Gen 4 is expected again to double. It hasn't yet been released. We're now in mid 2014, so it might be released later this year or early next year. And also one point to mention about PCI Express, it has so much bandwidth that there's no need for separate AGP graphics slots on the motherboard, so it all is consolidated to a common PCI Express architecture on the motherboard. And this completes the overview of legacy PC buses. And to learn more where we left off, please see the separate presentation PCI Express 101, in which I will be covering many technical details of PCI Express and how it is very different from the parallel buses that preceded it. Thank you very much.
Drives use either a serial ATA connection, commonly referred to as SATA, or a 40-pin IDE connection, which is standard in most existing cable connections, including the flat IDE ribbon cable and standard 4-pin Molex connector to connect your new SATA. Ensure the opposite end of your IDE ribbon cable is securely attached to an IDE port on your motherboard. Remember, there should be no secondary or slave drive attached to the same IDE cable. There are no jumpers to set or drivers to.
This is a 256 gig solid state drive that is using SATA connections to be able to communicate. And we'll look closer at what that might look like. SATA stands for serial AT attachment. That AT attachment being that older AT computer, one of the original style computers, and we've kept the terminology through the years. Although the original computers are well beyond us, we have this serial AT attachment to have some comparison back to the older parallel AT attachment, or PATA. We have different standards for SATA. One of the original SATA versions was version 1.0. It ran at 1.5 gigabits per second. There's also another standard, which is the SATA revision 2.0, which is running at 3.0 gigabits per second. The latest SATA standard goes even faster than that. That's SATA revision 3.0 that runs at 6 gigabits per second. One thing you have to watch for is occasionally you will see people abbreviate 3 gigabits per second as 3G. And we can sometimes confuse 3G with third generation. That's not really the case. I've been very careful here to show you SATA revision 1, SATA revision 2, and SATA revision 3, and then the speeds of those being 1.5 gigabits per second, 3 gigabits per second, and 6 gigabits per second. So if you're looking at standards for SATA, make sure you don't confuse any of that terminology. It can become confusing when you're dealing with different versions and different speeds, but as long as you synchronize those up, you shouldn't have a problem. One of the advantages that SATA brings to the table is that the connections are much smaller on the motherboard. You can see one of the older IDE or PATA connections on this motherboard, and this motherboard also has SATA connections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different SATA connections. If you were to look at these cables side by side, you'd really see the difference. PATA uses these larger ribbon connections. Here's the SATA connections, a much smaller connector on the motherboard and a much smaller cable that's being used to the storage device. So for the purposes of managing cables inside of your computer and making sure that the airflow is maintained through your computer, SATA has some distinct advantages. This is the back of a SATA drive, very similar to the PATA in that your interfaces are on this side. It's actually this very small interface is the SATA data connection. This larger interface is actually the power for SATA. You've also got these jumpers, and then you have an older traditional power connection. This drive was built for a computer that may be transitioning between PATA and SATA, and they gave you the option you could either plug in with the newer SATA power, or you could plug in with the older 4-pin Molex connector onto this drive. You would only choose one of those. You wouldn't need to plug both of those in. One of the advantages with SATA, however, is there's the capability on a number of drives to do hot swapping. You could unplug this drive while your system was powered up and plug it back in. That would be something you would not commonly do, and you would certainly want to take proper precautions when you were doing something like that, but it is part of the SATA standard. If we were to look at the top of the drive itself, it would give us that documentation of what we just saw with the power on one side, our serial connection, which is the data connection to our motherboard, the jumpers that are on the side, and there's a legacy power connection built in right into the documentation on the top of the drive. If your power supply had some of the newer SATA connections, you would simply plug the power connection into the SATA power and you would plug your data cable into the SATA connector on the drive. If you have an older power supply, then you would plug it in very much like this picture shows, where you still have the same data connection, but you would use this legacy Molex power connector to make sure the drive was operational.